I walked into my kitchen at 4:15 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, arms full of groceries from the store, and I heard Vanessa's voice before I saw her. Calm, measured, almost clinical, telling my mother-in-law Diane that I won't fight it once it's done. And my blood went cold because, what wouldn't I fight? And why was our family friend of 11 years discussing my future like I was a chess piece? To be moved, rather than a person who lived in this house. I set the bags down quietly on the counter, careful not to make noise, and moved closer to where they sat in the breakfast nook. And that's when I saw my husband Kyle sitting with them, his posture relaxed, his face showing something that looked disturbingly like relief. And Diane was nodding along saying, "She'll understand eventually. She always does." And Vanessa replied, "The paperwork is ready. Once we present it properly, she'll see we're doing this for her benefit." And Kyle added softly, "She's been so stressed lately. This will help." And I stood there frozen in my own doorway, realizing they'd already made plans, already decided my fate, already betrayed me together while I was out buying vegetables and milk like nothing was wrong. They didn't know I was there, didn't hear me come in, and I watched them for another 30 seconds as they discussed timeline and approach and how to handle my expected resistance. And the casual conspiracy of it. The comfortable way they sat together planning whatever this was, told me this wasn't the first conversation. This was just the latest in a series I'd never been invited to, and the trust I'd built with Vanessa over 11 years shattered in that moment like glass hitting concrete, sharp and irreparable, and everywhere. My name is April Winters, and I'm 38 years old, married to Kyle for 10 years after dating for 2, living in a comfortable split-level house, in a neighborhood where everyone knows your business, whether you share it or not. And until that Wednesday, I believed my life was built on solid ground with people I could trust. Vanessa Pierce had been part of our lives since before Kyle and I got engaged. Introduced at a mutual friend's barbecue where she'd immediately clicked with both of us. Funny and warm. And the kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought soup when you were sick and showed up for the boring parts of life, not just the celebrations. She'd been a bridesmaid at our wedding, had held my hand through 2 miscarriages that broke my heart, had been the first person I called when my father died, and I couldn't stop crying. And she'd become like a sister to me. Closer than my actual sister who lived across the country and called twice a year. We'd spent holidays together, taken weekend trips, shared secrets I'd never told anyone else, and I'd trusted her completely. The kind of trust that doesn't question or doubt because it's been tested and proven over years of showing up. She was single, never married, and she'd told me once that our family was her family, that Kyle and I and Diane were the closest thing she had to real belonging, and I'd felt honored by that, felt like we were giving her something precious. Never imagining she'd use that access to poison everything from the inside. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, but trust makes you blind to certain patterns, and I'd been very blind for a very long time. The first crack I ignored happened about 8 months ago during a dinner party we hosted, just family and close friends, including Vanessa. And I'd been telling a story about a difficult client at my job as an office manager when Vanessa interrupted gently to correct a detail I'd gotten wrong, except I hadn't gotten it wrong, I'd been there, and she hadn't. But she insisted with a small laugh that I must be confused because stress affects memory. Kyle had nodded along, agreeing that I'd seemed tired lately, and the conversation moved on while I sat there feeling oddly diminished, like my own experience had been questioned and dismissed in my own home. After that, I started noticing small comments. Suggestions that I was overreacting to normal situations. Observations that I seemed more emotional than usual. Gentle reminders that everyone gets overwhelmed sometimes and there's no shame in admitting it. Always delivered with concern, always in front of Kyle or Diane, always positioning Vanessa as the reasonable one and me as the one who needed patience. She'd started having private conversations with Kyle too. I'd walk into rooms and they'd stop talking, or she'd text him directly instead of our group chat. And when I asked about it, Kyle said they were just coordinating schedules or discussing surprise plans for me. And I'd believed him, because why wouldn't I? She'd begun spending more time with Diane as well, meeting for coffee or lunch, and Diane would mention things Vanessa had said about me, concerns about my stress levels, observations about my mood swings, suggestions that maybe I needed support I wasn't asking for. And I'd brushed it off as Vanessa being caring, never seeing the pattern forming, the narrative being constructed where I was struggling. And they were the concerned supporters trying to help someone too proud or confused to accept it. The plan revealed itself in pieces over the next hour as I stood in that kitchen listening, and what I learned made my stomach turn with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They were proposing a restructuring of our household finances and decision-making authority, presented as temporary support during what Vanessa called my difficult period, and Diane explained that they'd consulted with a financial advisor who'd helped them draft documents that would allow Kyle to manage our joint accounts independently, while I focused on reducing stress and getting back to myself. Vanessa had apparently suggested this arrangement weeks ago, pointing out that I'd been making small financial mistakes, forgetting to pay a bill on time, overdrawing our account once by $30, questioning a large purchase Kyle had made, and these mistakes, she'd told them, were signs that I was overwhelmed and needed the burden of financial management lifted temporarily. Kyle had agreed readily, saying he'd noticed the same things, and Diane had offered to help coordinate everything because she'd been through something similar with Kyle's father years ago and knew how to handle it sensitively. The documents were already prepared, sitting in Vanessa's car apparently, and the plan was to present them to me that evening over dinner, a united front of people who loved me, explaining calmly why this was necessary and good and nothing to be upset about. And once I signed, Kyle would have full control of our money, our mortgage payments, our savings, our credit cards, everything, while I would need to ask permission for purchases over $50. My consent was never part of the plan. They'd already decided, already prepared, already assumed I'd agree once they explained it properly, and the arrogance of that assumption was almost as offensive as the plan itself. I waited until Vanessa left, claiming she had an appointment but would return for dinner with the paperwork, and then I confronted Kyle in our bedroom, where he couldn't avoid me or perform for an audience. I asked him directly what they'd been discussing, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable before admitting that Vanessa had approached him a month ago with concerns about my behavior, saying she'd noticed signs that worried her as my closest friend, that I seemed scattered and forgetful and unusually emotional, and she thought maybe the stress of my job and managing household finances was becoming too much. He said she'd presented it so logically with specific examples I couldn't even remember happening, and she'd suggested that temporarily taking financial pressure off me might help me recover my equilibrium. And didn't I always say I hated dealing with bills and budgets anyway? So really this was solving a problem I'd complained about for years. I asked him why he'd believed Vanessa's assessment over asking me directly if I was struggling. And he looked away and said, "You're too emotional to see it yourself." That's what Vanessa explained. People who are overwhelmed don't recognize it. They just keep pushing until they break, and she didn't want to see you break. And his voice held such conviction, such certainty, that Vanessa's judgment was more valid than my own self-knowledge, that I realized he'd already chosen her guidance over my voice, had already decided I was the problem that needed solving, rather than his partner whose perspective mattered. I asked if he'd agreed to this plan, if he'd signed things, if he'd made commitments without me. And he nodded slowly and said, "Vanessa drew up the papers with Diane's lawyer friend. I just need your signature to make it official. It's temporary, April, just until you're feeling better." And I knew then that feeling better meant compliant, meant accepting their control, meant never questioning or pushing back, and my husband had signed on for that future without hesitation. The family dinner happened anyway, because canceling would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. And I sat at Diane's table that Sunday, watching decisions about my life discussed as if I were invisible or irrelevant or already defeated. Vanessa was there looking polished and confident, and she'd brought the documents in a leather folder that she placed on the sideboard like a centerpiece. And throughout the meal, they talked around me and over me and about me without actually including me in the conversation. Diane mentioned how much easier life would be once things were organized properly. And Kyle agreed that structure was important, and Vanessa added gently that sometimes the kindest thing friends could do was provide clarity when someone was too overwhelmed to see straight. And I sat there, cutting my pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces, while they built their case in front of me. When dessert was served, Diane actually turned to Vanessa instead of me to ask what I'd prefer, pie or cake. And Vanessa answered for me, saying I'd been watching my sugar intake lately, so probably just coffee, which was news to me because I hadn't been watching anything. But Kyle nodded agreement, like this was common knowledge, and I felt myself disappearing. My preferences erased, my voice deemed unnecessary because others had appointed themselves my representatives. The humiliation was quiet but complete, a steady dismissal that made me feel like a child at the adult table, seen but not heard, present but not important. And the worst part was how comfortable they all seemed with this dynamic, how natural it felt to them to speak for me, decide for me, manage me, and I sat there quietly furious, but careful not to show it because I'd learned something crucial in that kitchen days earlier. Showing anger would only confirm their narrative that I was emotional and unstable. So I needed to stay calm, stay quiet, and let them think I was accepting what I was actually planning to dismantle. I stopped defending myself after that dinner because I realized every time I explained my perspective, or corrected their false claims, or pointed out inconsistencies in their concerns, they used my defensiveness as evidence that I was too emotional to think clearly. That my resistance proved their point about my instability, that my very act of pushing back confirmed I needed the control they were offering. Vanessa had a gift for reframing everything. When I said I wasn't forgetful, she'd say gently that denial was common. When I pointed out I'd managed our finances successfully for 10 years, she'd note that past competence didn't guarantee current capacity. When I got frustrated with the circular logic, she'd touch my arm sympathetically and say stress was making me reactive. And there was no way to win an argument where my every response was reinterpreted as pathology. So I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, stopped defending, and I started listening instead. Really listening, not to their words, but to the patterns underneath, to who said what and when, to whose narrative was being privileged and whose was being dismissed, to the structure of power being built around me. They mistook my silence for surrender, for acceptance, for the calm that comes when someone finally stops fighting reality. And Diane actually commented at the next family gathering that I seemed so much more peaceful lately. And Vanessa agreed that stepping back from conflict was a sign of growth. Kyle looked relieved, his shoulders less tense, his smile more genuine, because he'd been dreading a fight that never came. And they all relaxed into their certainty that the problem was solved, that I'd seen reason, that the papers would be signed without resistance. And their comfort gave me room to operate, because comfortable people get careless, and careless people reveal more than they intend to. Vanessa overplayed her hand 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner, during a casual coffee date at my kitchen table where we'd sat hundreds of times before. But this time, I was listening differently, watching differently. And she made a comment that stopped me cold. We'd been discussing my job, and I'd mentioned considering asking for a raise because I'd taken on additional responsibilities, and Vanessa's face had showed something like concern as she said, "Are you sure that's wise right now? I know your last performance review wasn't great, and adding pressure when you're already stretched might backfire." And I stared at her because my last performance review had been excellent. I'd gotten a bonus and expanded duties, and I'd never mentioned any review to Vanessa because we didn't work together, and she had no connection to my employer. I asked her carefully what she meant, and she backtracked slightly, saying she must have been thinking of something Kyle had mentioned, that she'd gotten confused. But the damage was done because Kyle didn't know details about my performance reviews either. I kept work and home mostly separate. Discussed general frustrations, but not specific evaluations. And there was no way Vanessa should have known anything about my reviews, good or bad. unless she'd been accessing information she shouldn't have. I started paying closer attention after that, noting small reveals. She knew the balance in our savings account, though I'd never shared it. She referenced a medical appointment I'd scheduled that I hadn't mentioned. She knew we were considering refinancing our mortgage, though that discussion had happened privately between Kyle and me. And each piece of knowledge she shouldn't have possessed painted a clearer picture of someone who'd been systematically gathering information, building a file, preparing a case against me with evidence I'd never known was being collected. I consulted a professional the following week, not to accuse anyone, but to understand exactly what rights I had and what leverage they thought they possessed. And I chose a lawyer named Angela Harper, 3 towns over, where no one knew our family and discretion was guaranteed. I explained the situation carefully, the proposed financial restructuring, the documents waiting for my signature, the narrative being built about my mental and emotional instability. And Angela listened without judgment before asking direct questions about my actual mental health, my financial management history, my employment status, my legal capacity. When I told her I'd never been diagnosed with anything, never been hospitalized, never even seen a therapist, never missed a mortgage payment or defaulted on a credit card, or made any genuine financial errors beyond normal human mistakes everyone makes occasionally, she leaned back and said, "Then they have no leverage. The documents they're asking you to sign are voluntary. You can refuse, and there's nothing they can do about it unless they want to pursue legal guardianship, which requires substantial medical evidence from neutral professionals proving you're genuinely incapacitated, and based on what you're telling me, that evidence doesn't exist." The relief was overwhelming, but also clarifying, because I'd been operating under the assumption that they had power I didn't understand, that their confidence meant they knew something I didn't. But Angela explained that confidence often masks weakness, that people who have real legal standing don't need manipulation and pressure and carefully staged interventions, they just proceed through proper channels. She asked if I wanted to take action now, and I said no. Not yet. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I responded, but I wanted documentation of this consultation, evidence that I'd sought legal counsel while supposedly too confused to make sound decisions. And she agreed to keep detailed records that would be available if the situation escalated beyond family pressure into legal action. The gaslighting shifted from gentle concern to something harder when I started pushing back, not dramatically but just firmly, asking questions instead of accepting statements, requesting proof instead of trusting assertions, and suddenly I was difficult. I was unstable. I was proving exactly why intervention was necessary. Vanessa came over unannounced one evening and found me reviewing our bank statements at the kitchen table. And her expression flickered with something like alarm before she composed herself and asked sweetly why I was doing that. Wasn't Kyle handling finances now? And I replied that Kyle wasn't handling anything because I hadn't signed any papers and didn't plan to. Her sweetness evaporated immediately, replaced by sharp edges I'd never seen before, and she said, "April, you're not thinking clearly. Everyone can see it, except you. The fact that you're fighting help is exactly why you need it." And when I asked her to name one specific example of my unclear thinking, one actual mistake I'd made, rather than vague claims about stress and emotion, she couldn't. She just repeated that people who are struggling don't see their own struggles. And my resistance was textbook denial. Kyle came home during this conversation and sided with Vanessa immediately, his voice rising as he said, I was being stubborn and making things harder than they needed to be, that he was tired of walking on eggshells wondering when I'd fall apart, that Vanessa had been nothing but supportive, and I was treating her like an enemy. And I looked at him and said calmly, "She's been gathering information about me without my knowledge, building a case that I'm incompetent, convincing you I'm unstable, so you'll give her access to our life, and you're angry at me for noticing?" And his face flushed red, but he had no answer, just turned to Vanessa for support, and she provided it instantly, telling him not to let me manipulate the situation. That deflection was another symptom of denial, and I watched my husband choose her interpretation over mine one more time. Diane showed her true face during a tense conversation at her house the following weekend, when Kyle had asked me to come for lunch because they wanted to clear the air, which I knew meant pressure me to cooperate, but I went anyway because avoiding them would only fuel their narrative. Diane had prepared a whole speech, it seemed, about family harmony and the importance of accepting help gracefully, and she told me directly that my feelings mattered less than family peace, that I was disrupting everyone with my stubbornness, that Kyle was stressed and Vanessa was hurt, and I needed to stop being selfish and think about the people around me for once. I asked her if she'd read the documents they wanted me to sign, if she understood they would give Kyle unilateral control over money I'd earned and assets I'd helped build, and she waved it away, saying details weren't important. What mattered was showing trust in my husband and gratitude to Vanessa for caring enough to intervene. I said trust should go both ways, that Kyle should trust me to manage what I'd been managing successfully for a decade. And Diane's face hardened into something cold as she replied, "Marriage isn't about both ways, April. It's about wives supporting their husbands, and right now, you're being a terrible wife by questioning Kyle's judgment and embarrassing him in front of people who care about him." The shock must have shown on my face because she continued, softer, but no kinder. "I raised my son to be a strong man, and he chose a partner who would support that strength. If you can't do that, if you need to fight and control and make everything difficult, then maybe you're not the partner he needs anymore." And I realized with perfect clarity that respect had never been part of the bargain in Diane's eyes, that she'd spent 10 years tolerating me while waiting for an opportunity to assert her vision of proper family hierarchy. And Vanessa had handed her that opportunity wrapped in concern and documentation. I discovered the private meetings by accident when I came home early from work one Thursday and found Vanessa's car in our driveway and Kyle's car in the garage, and I entered quietly through the side door and heard their voices in Kyle's home office, low and serious, and I stood in the hallway and listened as they discussed strategy. Vanessa was saying they needed to move faster, that I was becoming resistant in ways she hadn't anticipated, that the soft approach wasn't working, and they might need to consider having me evaluated professionally, and Kyle hesitated before agreeing that maybe she was right. Maybe they needed documentation from a real doctor, and Vanessa said she knew someone who could help, someone who understood these situations and would be thorough but sympathetic, and I realized they'd been meeting regularly without my knowledge. That this wasn't a friendship offering advice, but a conspiracy preparing for my resistance. I backed out silently and left the house, drove around for 2 hours processing what I'd heard, and when I came home through the front door loudly, they were in the living room watching television like nothing had happened. And Vanessa greeted me warmly, asking about my day, and the ease of her deception was stunning. The way she could plot my psychological evaluation in private and then smile at me like we were still sisters, like nothing had changed, like trust still existed between us. I asked Kyle later that night what he and Vanessa had discussed, and he said casually that she'd stopped by to drop off a book. They'd chatted for a few minutes, nothing important, and the lie confirmed everything I needed to know about where his loyalties had shifted. How completely Vanessa had replaced me as his primary confidant, and how prepared they both were to deceive me while claiming everything they did was for my benefit. I began my exit strategy the next morning with methodical calm, doing exactly what Angela Harper had advised weeks earlier. But I'd been too hopeful to implement, believing somehow that truth would win without requiring strategic preparation. I gathered every important document I could find: birth certificate, social security card, passport, marriage license, tax returns, insurance policies, vehicle titles, and placed them in a fireproof safe I purchased and kept at my office where no one could access them. I opened a new checking account at a different bank under my maiden name, April Chen, which was legally still part of my name, though I didn't use it socially. And I started diverting my paycheck there, leaving just enough in our joint account to avoid suspicion, but protecting my income from any future control Kyle might attempt. I photographed every document in our filing cabinet, every statement, every contract, creating digital backup of our entire financial history, because I'd learned that people who plan psychological evaluations also tend to hide evidence that contradicts their narrative. I changed my passwords on every account, enabled two-factor authentication, and revoked Kyle's access to my email and social media, which he'd had since we married, but now felt dangerous. I researched apartments in nearby towns, called 3 landlords, and filled out applications under my maiden name so I'd have a place to go if staying became impossible. The activity should have felt frantic or desperate, but instead I felt calm for the first time in months, because action erases helplessness, and every document secured, every dollar protected, every backup plan established was a brick in a wall they couldn't breach. And knowing I could leave if necessary meant I was no longer trapped, no longer at their mercy, no longer dependent on their goodwill or their version of reality. Vanessa made her critical mistake 10 days later via email, a message meant for Kyle but sent to me by accident because our names were adjacent in her phone contacts, and she'd been careless, overconfident, certain that everything was proceeding according to plan. The email read, "Kyle, talk to Dr. Morton this morning. He's willing to do the evaluation next Thursday. Bring April in under the pretense of a general checkup. He'll know what to look for and how to frame the findings. Once we have his report, we can move forward with the financial restructuring, even if she won't sign voluntarily. Diane has already contacted her lawyer friend about the paperwork. Everything is in place. We're almost done." I read it 3 times, my hands shaking not with fear but with rage and vindication, because here was written proof of a conspiracy, proof that they'd corrupted a doctor into providing false evaluation, proof that voluntary cooperation had always been theater, and they'd planned from the start to force compliance through manufactured medical evidence. I forwarded the email to my personal account immediately, saved screenshots to 3 different cloud services, printed 2 copies and placed them in separate secure locations, then forwarded it to Angela Harper with a brief explanation, and her response came within the hour. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud and potentially medical malpractice. Don't go to that appointment. Don't confront them yet. Let them proceed thinking you don't know, and they'll create more evidence. This is enough to destroy their credibility completely. But more is better." I replied asking if I should respond to the email, and she said no, silence was better. Let Vanessa worry about whether I'd seen it. Let uncertainty make them reckless. So I deleted it from my inbox as if I'd never opened it, and went about my day pretending ignorance while actually holding a grenade with the pin pulled, just waiting for the right moment to let go. The confrontation I'd been dreading and planning arrived naturally when Kyle mentioned casually that I had a doctor's appointment Thursday morning. He'd made it weeks ago and forgotten to tell me, just a general checkup since I hadn't been in a while. And would I mind going, because Diane had expressed concern about my health and he wanted to reassure her. I asked which doctor, and he named Dr. Morton, someone I'd never seen, whose practice was 40 minutes away in a town where we had no connection. And I asked why not my regular physician, and Kyle said Dr. Morton was a friend of Vanessa's, who'd agreed to fit me in as a favor, and the lies were so casual, so practiced, so confident, that I almost admired the audacity. I said calmly, "I'm not going to an appointment with a doctor I don't know, arranged by people who've been planning to have me declared incompetent." And Kyle's face went white, then red, and he demanded how I knew, what had I heard, who had I talked to, and I just looked at him steadily and said, "I know everything. The meetings, the planning, the corruption of medical professionals, all of it." And I watched him realize I wasn't guessing. I had evidence. I'd been 3 steps ahead while he thought I was stumbling behind. He tried to reframe, saying they were just trying to help, that Dr. Morton was qualified and objective, that I was being paranoid, but his voice shook because he knew the lie was collapsing. And when I asked him directly, "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I was so incompetent that I wouldn't notice my own husband conspiring with our supposed friend to strip away my autonomy?" He had no answer, just sat down heavily and put his face in his hands. I stood and said, "I'm done, Kyle, with the manipulation, with Vanessa, with your mother, with this marriage. You chose their lies over my truth, and that's a choice you don't get to take back. And I walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there, and I felt nothing but relief. Kyle panicked over the next 3 days in ways that would have been satisfying if they hadn't been so transparent and calculated. He suddenly wanted to talk, to explain, to reconnect, following me from room to room, insisting we could work through this if I'd just listen. But his words rang hollow because he wasn't apologizing for the conspiracy, just for getting caught. He demanded to know what I was planning, whether I'd hired a lawyer, whether I was going to leave, whether I'd told anyone else. And his panic was less about losing me and more about losing control of the narrative, about what would happen if the truth spread beyond our household. He tried calling Vanessa constantly, but she wasn't returning his calls, which I found grimly amusing because conspirators scatter when their plot collapses, and suddenly, Diane was unavailable too, claiming illness when Kyle reached out for guidance. I told him nothing about my preparations, my secured accounts, my rented apartment that was sitting empty and ready, my documented evidence stored in multiple locations, because information was leverage, and I was done giving him leverage over anything in my life. He grew desperate, his voice rising, his hands shaking, saying I couldn't just leave without talking to him first, that I owed him a real conversation after 10 years of marriage, and I replied calmly, "You're right. I did owe you conversation. You owed me conversation before plotting with Vanessa and your mother to have me medically evaluated under false pretenses. You owed me conversation before deciding I was incompetent to manage my own life. You owed me conversation before choosing their manipulation over your vows. But you didn't give me any of those conversations, so now you get silence." And his face crumpled, but I felt nothing, because he'd shown me exactly who he was when he thought I wouldn't notice. And believing him now would just be choosing denial over reality. Vanessa's apology arrived via text message at 11:43 p.m. on a Saturday, long and rambling and strategically vague, saying she'd been thinking about our friendship and realized she'd overstepped boundaries, that she'd let her concern override her respect for my autonomy, that she valued our relationship too much to let a misunderstanding destroy years of trust. The word misunderstanding was particularly offensive, as if accidentally sending a damning email about corrupting a doctor was a misunderstanding, as if systematically gathering evidence against me was a communication error, as if plotting my financial subjugation was just excessive caring that went too far. She texted again the next morning asking if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, to clear the air and rebuild what had been damaged, and her tone was gentle, conciliatory, the voice of the friend I used to know, except I knew now that voice had always been performance, strategy, manipulation dressed in warmth. I didn't respond immediately, letting her sit with uncertainty, and she texted twice more over the next few days, apologizing more specifically for the email, saying it had been poorly worded, that she'd never meant to go through with anything, it was just frustrated venting after I'd been so resistant to help, and wasn't friendship supposed to allow for mistakes and growth and forgiveness? I finally responded simply, "Friendship requires trust, and you destroyed that systematically over months. Your apology doesn't rebuild what you deliberately tore down. Please don't contact me again." And I blocked her number before she could reply, because her goal wasn't peace, it was regaining control, finding a way back into my life where she could operate, and I was done being anyone's target or project or problem to solve. The family meeting I demanded happened on neutral ground, Angela Harper's conference room where recording was legal and witnesses were present, and I'd invited Kyle, Diane, and Vanessa, telling them only that we needed to address the situation formally, and I had legal representation that would be present. They arrived looking nervous and defensive, Diane in particular radiating hostility, and Vanessa wore her concerned friend face. But it slipped when she saw the conference table, the recording equipment, Angela in her professional suit taking notes. I presented the truth, calmly, methodically, with none of the emotion they'd spent months attributing to me. I showed timelines of their conspiracy with dated conversations and documented meetings. I showed Vanessa's email about corrupting Dr. Morton with her digital signature, confirming she'd sent it. I showed text messages between Kyle and Diane discussing how to handle me. I showed financial records proving I'd never made the mistakes they'd claimed. I showed my employment records proving my performance reviews had been excellent. And I showed Angela's documentation that I'd sought legal counsel while supposedly too incompetent to make sound decisions. The conference room was silent, except for my voice and the occasional rustle of papers, and I watched their faces change from defensive to shocked to panicked as they realized I had evidence of everything, that their private conspiracy had been thoroughly documented, that their attempts to control me had been predicted and countered and preserved for legal scrutiny. When I finished, Angela asked if they disputed any of the evidence presented. And none of them spoke, because you can't dispute emails you sent, texts you wrote, meetings you attended, and their silence was admission, confirmation, surrender. The collapse was quiet and complete, no dramatic shouting or theatrical breakdown, just three people realizing simultaneously that they'd lost and the consequences would be real. Vanessa tried first, her voice shaking, saying she'd made mistakes but her intentions had always been good. That she genuinely believed I was struggling and needed intervention. And couldn't I see she'd acted out of love, out of friendship, out of desperate concern? But her words rang hollow against the evidence of systematic planning, corrupted medical evaluation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Kyle deflected, his voice defensive, saying he'd been manipulated too, that Vanessa had convinced him I was declining, that he'd been trying to help. And yes, maybe the methods were wrong, but the goal was always my well-being. Though he couldn't explain why my well-being required stripping me of financial control and decision-making authority. Diane lashed out, because that was her nature, saying I'd always been difficult, always made things harder than they needed to be, always refused to accept proper family structure, and this whole situation could have been avoided if I'd just signed the papers and trusted that people older and wiser knew what was best. And her anger revealed everything. She'd never seen me as Kyle's equal partner, but as an obstacle to her continued control over her son's household. Angela let them speak without interruption, then said calmly, "You're each confirming conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted medical manipulation, and coordinated harassment. I'd suggest you consult your own legal counsel before saying anything else." And their faces showed they finally understood. This wasn't family drama to be smoothed over. This was actionable legal behavior with real consequences. And I watched their unity fracture in real time as they started glancing at each other with suspicion instead of solidarity, wondering who would be blamed, who would face consequences, who would throw whom under the bus to minimize personal damage. The consequences arrived quietly over the following weeks, not through lawsuits or criminal charges, but through the steady withdrawal of access and trust that turned Vanessa's life smaller and darker. I didn't need to spread rumors or make accusations publicly. The evidence I'd presented to Kyle, Diane, and Vanessa spread naturally as they tried to defend themselves to other family members and friends, and each person they told ended up seeing the emails, the texts, the timeline, and drawing their own conclusions about someone who'd systematically betray a friend while claiming concern. Vanessa's invitations dried up as people stopped including her in gatherings, stopped calling for coffee dates, stopped asking for her perspective on anything because who trusts someone who builds cases against their closest friends? Her church community, where she'd been active for years, grew distant after someone mentioned the situation to the pastor, who quietly suggested she might find fellowship elsewhere given the concerns about her judgment and ethics. Her professional reputation suffered too. She worked as a consultant for small businesses, and several clients declined to renew contracts after hearing that she'd been involved in attempting medical fraud, because businesses don't hire people with questionable ethics to advise on sensitive matters. The loss wasn't dramatic or public, just steady erosion. Invitations that stopped coming, calls that weren't returned, friendly waves that turned into polite nods and then into avoided eye contact. And I heard through Kyle's sister that Vanessa had started seeing a therapist to process why her life was falling apart, never quite grasping that actions have consequences, that destroying trust destroys relationships, That people who manipulate eventually find themselves alone. My marriage ended with less drama than the conspiracy that preceded it. Just paperwork and mediation sessions, where Angela represented my interests, and Kyle hired his own attorney who looked increasingly uncomfortable as evidence was presented. We divided assets exactly down the middle, because I could prove I'd contributed equally throughout our marriage. And Kyle couldn't dispute my financial competence when faced with 10 years of records showing responsible management. I kept my car, my retirement account, half our savings, and my freedom, while he kept the house, his retirement account, his share of our savings, and the relationship with his mother who'd orchestrated the whole disaster. He tried apologizing near the end, saying he'd been stupid, that Vanessa had manipulated him too, that he still loved me and wished we could start over. But his apology felt like negotiation rather than genuine remorse, and I told him honestly, "You didn't just make a mistake, Kyle. You chose to believe lies about me instead of asking if I was okay. You chose to plan my subjugation instead of communicating your concerns. You chose Vanessa's narrative over 10 years of partnership. Those were choices, not accidents, and I can't be married to someone who makes those choices." The divorce finalized on a Tuesday morning in September, and I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in a year, because I was finally done carrying the weight of other people's attempts to control me. Done defending my competence to people who'd decided I was incompetent. Done trying to prove my worth to a man who'd let his mother and a manipulative friend convince him I had none. Diane's regret came too late to matter, arriving as a letter 3 months after the divorce finalized. Handwritten on her expensive stationery, explaining that she'd been reflecting on her behavior and realized she'd been wrong to support Vanessa's plan, wrong to prioritize control over relationship with me, wrong to assume she knew better than I did about my own life. The letter was full of justifications. She genuinely believed I was struggling. Vanessa had been so convincing, she'd only wanted to protect her son. But underneath the excuses was the real message. She'd lost access to me, lost influence over Kyle's life decisions now that I wasn't there to provide counterbalance. And she wanted back in, wanted forgiveness, wanted restoration of relationship on her terms. I read the letter once and filed it away without responding, because Diane had shown me exactly who she was when she thought she had power. And her regret, now that I'd removed myself from her control, was just frustration. That her tactics had backfired, not genuine understanding of the harm she'd caused. Kyle's sister told me later that Diane had been complaining to family about how I'd poisoned Kyle against her. How the divorce was really my revenge plot against the whole family. How she was the real victim of my vindictiveness, and the narrative revealed she'd learned nothing. Still saw herself as wronged, rather than as someone who'd participated in conspiracy and lost. Still believed her intentions mattered more than her actions. Her influence over Kyle had indeed diminished because he'd started seeing a therapist who'd helped him recognize his mother's manipulation, and Diane blamed me for that too. But I felt only distant satisfaction that consequences had found everyone involved. That control built on manipulation eventually collapses under its own weight, and that I'd removed myself before being crushed underneath. Vanessa came back 9 months after everything collapsed, showing up at my new apartment without invitation or warning, and I found her waiting by my car one evening when I came home from work. She looked smaller somehow, her confident posture replaced by something tentative and desperate, and she asked if we could talk, just for a few minutes, because she needed me to understand something important. I considered telling her to leave, but curiosity won, so I let her speak standing there in the parking lot while I kept my hand on my car keys, ready to leave if necessary. She said she'd been wrong about everything. That therapy had helped her see she'd been trying to control my life, because her own felt empty and purposeless. That our friendship had become the center of her identity. And when she felt it slipping away, she'd panicked and tried to force it into a shape she could manage. She said she understood now that she'd betrayed me, destroyed years of trust, and she wasn't asking for forgiveness exactly. Just acknowledgement that she recognized the harm and was trying to become someone better. Then she asked if I could help her. recommend a therapist who understood friendship trauma. Maybe put in a good word with some of the friends who'd cut her off. Possibly consider meeting for coffee in 6 months if she could prove she'd changed. And I realized even her apology was transactional. Still asking me to manage her emotions and solve her problems and provide access to resources I'd built. I said clearly, "No, Vanessa, I can't help you. I won't recommend anyone, won't contact anyone on your behalf, won't meet you for coffee in 6 months or 6 years. What you did wasn't a mistake or a mental health crisis, it was sustained, calculated betrayal over months. I hope you do get better, genuinely. But your healing isn't my responsibility, and your consequences aren't my problem to solve." And I got in my car and drove away while she stood there looking lost, and I felt nothing but relief that I'd held the boundary. The final boundary came as a text message 3 weeks after Vanessa's parking lot ambush, when she tried once more via text, saying she understood I needed space, but hoped I'd reconsider eventually, because friendship was too precious to lose forever. And I realized she still didn't understand that some things, once broken, don't get fixed. That trust destroyed systematically doesn't rebuild through repeated requests. I called instead of texting back, because some messages need voice to carry their finality. And when she answered hopeful, I said calmly, "Vanessa, I need you to understand something clearly. Trust, once destroyed the way you destroyed it, doesn't get rebuilt on demand. You spent months gathering evidence against me, planning my financial subjugation, corrupting medical professionals, manipulating my husband, and presenting it all as friendship and concern. That wasn't a mistake. That was betrayal, executed with precision and planning. The fact that you regret it now doesn't obligate me to forgive it, doesn't require me to give you access to my life again, doesn't mean friendship is waiting if you just try hard enough. Some doors close permanently. This is one of them. Please respect that I've made my decision and stop contacting me." And I hung up before she could respond and blocked her number permanently this time. And the finality felt right, felt clean, felt like the last brick in a wall I'd been building for over a year. She didn't reach out again after that, either because she finally understood or because she'd found someone else to focus on. And I didn't care which, because her presence in my life had ended either way. And the empty space she left filled quickly with people who showed up without agenda, who respected boundaries without resenting them, who understood that real friendship doesn't require control or manipulation or systematic destruction of autonomy. I'm 40 now. 18 months past the afternoon I walked into my kitchen and heard people planning my future without me, and my life looks nothing like it did then in ways that matter more than geography or relationship status. I live in a small 2-bedroom apartment I chose and furnished myself. Work at the same job where my performance reviews remain excellent despite Vanessa's fabricated claims. Spend time with friends who prove their character by respecting my boundaries rather than demanding I lower them. And I sleep better than I have in years, because my space is mine. Controlled by me. Open only to people who've earned access through consistent respect, rather than assumed it through blood or history. Sometimes I think about Vanessa's smile when she told me I wouldn't fight once it was done, about Diane's certainty that I needed to submit to proper family structure, about Kyle's relief when he thought I'd accepted their control. And I feel grateful not for the betrayal itself, but for what it taught me about recognizing manipulation before it destroys you, about trusting my own perception even when everyone around me insists I'm wrong, about the difference between people who love you and people who love controlling the narrative about you. Kyle tried to reconnect last month, sending an email saying he understood now how wrong he'd been, that therapy had shown him his mother's manipulation patterns, that he'd made a terrible mistake, choosing Vanessa's lies over our partnership. And would I consider talking, maybe exploring whether we could rebuild? And I deleted it without responding because some mistakes are too fundamental to recover from. And believing him now would just be choosing hope over history. They thought destroying my trust would break me, would make me dependent, would force me to accept their control because the alternative was isolation. But betrayal didn't break me. It sharpened me, taught me exactly who I was beneath the roles people had assigned me, Taught me that patience and documentation win over confrontation and emotion. Taught me that silence can be strategy rather than surrender. And most importantly, taught me who I never needed again. And that knowledge, hard-won and painful as it was, gave me a freedom I'd never had when I was trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me as something to manage rather than someone to respect.